Okay, thank you very much for joining us. The structure of this panel is going to be fairly straightforward. We're going to have statements from each of the speakers within 5 minutes or less. And if I've moderated you before, you know that I keep times. Then we're going to start with 3 questions just to really get into the practical aspects of what we can and what we should do. And if there is time, hopefully we'll have questions from the audience. So Cyrus, would you like to begin?
Okay, with a statement to start with. I'll gather and put one together and maybe explain the work that I'm doing in the UAE with the UAE AI minister, and particularly what we're doing with the global governance of AI roundtable that we started convening last year. We have, when we look at the list, we have approximately 20% of this audience being there, so we have a strong focus on AI safety. So this roundtable is being gathered at the World Government Summit, which is happening every year in Dubai. And as its name says, it's about convening and discussing stories around technology and others that will have an impact on society, and how will government link with that. So since we have a UAE Minister of AI for a year now, and he's also leading this summit, he has this fantastic convening power to bring a really truly multi-stakeholder approach with people from the civil society, from the scientific community, but also from governments, international organizations, and others, to gather and discuss this. So that's one of the questions that you're going to ask, but I'm giving it up right now. So it's basically what we have in the UAE is truly a unique geostrategic location. We're extremely friendly with the US. We're extremely friendly with China. So obviously these are the 2 AI superpowers so this on its own is fantastic. But on top of this, we're friendly with Russia. We're friendly with India. We're friendly with Europe. So we have this unique neutral platform where we can have a global conversation discussing about governance of AI and impact of AI on society. Part of this discussion, and that's what we're doing right now, with many of you are present in this room, is bringing the dialogue on AGI and the impact of society, and starting thinking about AI safety issues.
Okay, thank you. Jason?
So I'm going to suggest that we use the Cold War as our role model, not as like a general rule, but just for about 5 minutes. And then it should stop being a role model for us. But there are several things that we can learn from the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, which was hostile, much more hostile than any relationship right now between AI powers, and yet was still able to support risk-reducing cooperation over decades. The first form of cooperation that was useful was informal engagement of the sort organized by the Pugwash conferences. And very much in the spirit of this conference was an effort to bring together international technologists, scientists, technocrats, in order to develop lines of communication that later ended up being quite important for back-channel discussions during crises. So doing more of this sort of work, and possibly similar conferences that seek to focus on the policy communities in their respective countries, and are known as sort of track 1.5 discussions, in which you invite government advisors as participants, but they don't play any formal role. Plus, if it's run by government, there won't be any free food. So that's another advantage of not having governments run the conferences. A second form of cooperation that was important during the Cold War were low-stakes technical collaborations. One example is Apollo-Soyuz, in which you had technologists from the US and the Soviet Union collaborating on a constructive project that didn't involve anyone trying to kill each other. And that was good both as a confidence-building measure and also to help build this connective tissue between the 2 communities. A third example of cooperation were high-stakes technical collaborations, one of which was the development of locks that secure nuclear weapons against unauthorized use. And one example for the AI community on that might be an international collaboration to pursue AI safety research, or possibly AI security research, maybe one whose goals have sort of short-term deliverables, something which is concrete and can show the benefits of that sort of cooperation. Another example of cooperation would be agreements to submit oneself to certain kinds of monitoring for confidence building. One example during the Cold War were open skies agreements in which countries would submit themselves to aerial reconnaissance so that we wouldn't become too anxious about what the other side was building or arming itself with. In the context of AI, as Miles and others have talked about, computing does look to be one bottleneck, and semiconductor manufacturing is fairly centralized. That's something that actually is amenable to some level of monitoring. So it might be interesting to explore what an international agreement to monitor, at least at sort of general volumes of production for semiconductors would look like. The last form of cooperation, I think the most difficult, are arms limitations treaties. And we have many examples of treaties which sought to either ban or limit the categories of certain destructive technologies. In the context of AI, one that I think could be an opportunity in the near term is for the next strategic arms limitation treaty to include some ban on the use of autonomy within nuclear command and control. So with that, I'll end and say we should no longer use the Cold War as a role model.
Great, thank you, Charlotte.
Yeah, so I'm going to do a mixture between what we just had. I'm going to kind of recap what I look at, and I'm also going to bring out two questions that I think are interesting. So my main focus is AI policy in the European Union. Why the European Union? Well, because the European Union was initially founded as the European Coal and Steel Community, so Germany and France couldn't go to war anymore, to have shared resources that would not make it ethically unthinkable, but also practically unthinkable that these countries could race and Europe would be dipped into World War III. So I'm not suggesting that we should all end up in a global single market and we need to have shared judicial or legislative branches or executive branches, but I think it might be worthwhile thinking about what could be a thing that if all actors collaborate on, it would make it impossible for one of them to break away and actually start racing again by themselves. So that's point one. Point two is, what is the European Union doing right now? Well, it's actually surprisingly still somewhat functional after this very inception point. It is currently looking at cooperation for artificial intelligence. So exactly the type of topic we're discussing here. They have signed, so by they I mean all the 28 member states plus Norway, have signed an agreement to cooperate on artificial intelligence. That is for financial means, that is for ethical and socio-economical reasons, so in terms of the labor market displacement, in terms of how do we educate the next generation, how do we upskill the workers that we already have, and that is also in terms of what common vision and goal do we want to have, which has been more specified recently in a plan for coordinated action on AI by the European Commission. And I assume I'll get the chance later on to speak a bit more in depth about this, but the Europeans' vision is basically to have ethical AI and trustworthy AI. And I will explain later on why I think that is a bit more than just a nice cover-up term for not doing anything else, and how this can actually eventually translate into a mechanism for governance that doesn't necessarily require all actors to agree on the same thing.
Okay, great.
Okay. I think before I go on to talk about my advice and recommendations, I have a question on the question that's being raised to us. And then we're talking about the race, but I was thinking, what race? If we're talking about, the AGI race, I mean, the whole research projects are so distributed. No one agrees on the actual path to AGI. So for me, it's at best, this race is as if it's a dim lighted cave. We don't know what the finishing line is. We don't know what the shortest distance is. And then so in a way, it's hard to define what the race is all about. If you can't define that, and then how can you talk about, how to coordinate between the different, stakeholders and stuff. So that's my question on the questions that are posed to us. But I think, perhaps, this community can help dispel some of the mysteries about this race. I'm also echoing some of the speakers there early on. So before I talk about the recommendations, I want to take another, I don't say one step back, I want to take 2 steps back. I think, I want to talk about my understanding of the conflicts and clash between US and China. I think essentially what we are seeing right now, it's not just merely trade disputes, and it's really sort of a civilization or cultural clash. So let me use a metaphor so that will allow us to understand better what US and China is all about. Let's say if you imagine it's an oil painting. You have multiple layers of paint. So at the top layer of paint, it's essentially US and China are speaking the same language. We're talking about economic terms and national interest, competition, efficiency, materialism, consumerism, okay, capitalism. That's sort of the same language that in the past 4 decades that both US and China have been talking about, so we understand each other. But that's only the top layer. If you go to the bottom layer, the grounding color of the oil painting, the 2 civilizations are very different. So if you look at the grounding color, let's say if you look at the US, I apologize that I'm sort of resorting to oversimplification here. It's much more of a monotheistic culture, individualistic, and then a lot of emphasis on zero-sum competition. And then actually when it comes to more of an intellectual, let's say purity and pursuit, there's a focus on logical purity, okay? So if you look at the China side, the Chinese culture, first of all, we're not religious, but we are spiritual, okay? There's a difference in here. And there's a whole commitment to this way of Tao, and then some of the Chinese colleagues talked about the unity of the heaven, Tian, and then the humans. There are a lot of those kind of spiritual concepts, and then we don't have a monotheistic culture. And then also the Chinese concept focus a lot more on inclusiveness and harmony, okay? And then also the concept that we have towards human beings, it's a relational being, okay? That kind of concept. It's not an individualistic. And then we pay a lot of attention to the context-driven, contextual-driven decision-making and thinking process. And then, of course, related to that is family-based decision-making. So in the US thinking, the best way is my way. In the Chinese thinking, we're actually looking for the most appropriate way. There's no such thing as the best thing. There's only most appropriate, depending on the context and circumstances. Okay, so that's why I want to highlight the different ways of approaching things and thinking that does inform all the geopolitical tension, as well as the approach to AI developments and the ethics issues. So I just want to raise, example. Let's say the concept of privacy, and then privacy in the Western context might be very different, differently understood in the China context. If you look at the broad spectrum, this side is individual, this side is a social good, be it social stability and then on this broad spectrum, China's approach to privacy is probably much more towards the social good side, and then much less on the individualistic side. So that's why I personally find it very hard to subscribe to general principles, AI principles, without understanding how they're going to apply it in the context. So I just want to use that as an example. So, but in terms of the recommendations and advice I have,
we should probably just do that within the questions, just so that all
But really quickly, I just want to say this is a great forum for that kind of a discussion. But I do hope we should actually bring out more value-based, civilizational kind of or cultural kind of a dialogue, because we want to go to the bottom, because that's the thing that informs everything that we're discussing about. And then, so the secondly is about the global project that actually Sean was talking about as well. Rather than conceiving a big, very sort of abstract concept, I was thinking about there's one thing which is less sensitive is care robots for elderly care. That's a global issue. And then so for in a way, we should actually cooperate in a more specific context. And then we can resolve all the privacy issue and the safety issue and security issue with respect to one specific product, and then we will see how different the cultural, understanding will be brought to play. So anyway, that's it.
Just a quick note, I did a lot of work on K-robots, and I could not agree with you less. But we'll get to that later. Okay.
Sure.
So first question from the panelists. From your point of view, what is the most pressing problem and the most promising opportunity with regards to international collaboration? Whoever wants to start? The dread.
So you asked for three.
I asked
points.
for one pressing problem and one promising opportunity.
Okay.
Let's keep it simple.
I can give it a shot if no one
Go
else
ahead.
wants to. The most pressing problem is the most obvious problem. Why would people want to collaborate?
Yeah.
What are the incentives to cooperate if you think that you can do it by yourself? So I think, again, very obvious, but that is the pressing problem. Now, how can you change that? I think that's what we're all here to discuss and figure out. One immediate step, I think, that harks back at what I said before about the European Union focusing on ethics is, so to embed what I say in the broader pictures, the European Union is currently working on guidelines for the ethical development of AI. So in these guidelines that are open to input, which someone mentioned on Friday, you have the statement that the European group on artificial intelligence, the expert group, wishes that ethical AI should be trustworthy, human-centric, robust, and secure, which are all quite exciting statements, I assume, for everyone here in this audience. Now the question is, how does that translate into something larger? So the idea behind this is that these guidelines will probably be used by the European Union in order to find partners in an international context that agree on these types of values. So everything the European Union does is based on the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So AI as well is going to be based, it needs to adhere to the Charter of Fundamental Rights, basically. So which other countries on the globe agree with these types of values? And you could go further beyond taking that as a rather straightforward and easily achievable basis of cooperation, agreeing on ethical principles, because you don't want each country to come up with their own ethical principles that are kind of the same but kind of slightly different, and then you have duplication efforts within countries and by different groups and across the globe. You could say, well, maybe we can come together on this. And this, being the ethics guidelines or an ethical charter or ethical principles, could also trickle down further in what I imagine, this is just an assumption, so take that with a pinch of salt, into certification standardization processes. So once we agree on how do we want AI to be developed and deployed, there are already organizations like the IEEE and the ISO looking at AI standardization and certification. Particularly the ISO has a working group on trustworthy AI. So I assume that in all of this diversity, there will be someone who looks at different countries or group statements and says, well, actually, all of this makes sense. Let's consider writing standards or safety certificates around this. And to me, that then in and of itself, so standardization, certification, which has also popped up in a lot of different policy papers across the globe, that X country wishes to develop AI seals of quality, for example. That then in itself is a kind of indirect way of governing the broader AI development and deployment, to me at the very least. It's not a complete solution, but it can go towards preventing certain small shortcomings that we already see right now in an indirect manner.
Okay, in the interest of time and in the interest of coffee, if no one wants to take a stab at the first question, we can move on to the second, which is if you could change one misconception in emerging AI, AGI governance structures, what would that be? And I think you alluded to that, so maybe you would want to...
Can I elaborate a
go
little
ahead.
more? Actually, by the way, the Cold War analogy really scared me. and then also, in the earlier panel, talk about the Stix. I think we are using way too much sort of legacy framework and the legacy concepts to think about the governance and principles and governance structure for for AGI or for the future. I think we really need to change our mindset, and then we really need to focus on, all inclusiveness. Let's not to forget that we're talking about AGI, we're talking about potential existential risk for the humans, but also potentially, a good relationship between humans and the machines in the future. So in other words, this issues of that scale, it does not, we can't use the past experience. I mean, we can use very little past experience. We really need to think about something new. And then so I would, think that we would much prefer this kind of more of a moral persuasion, and then more, that's why value-based discussion, and then come up with something more inclusive, and then really want to pitch at the level for the global narratives that it is a global issue. It is an issue faced by the entire humanity. It's not just US wins and then China loses, and vice versa. So that's like the one huge misconception we should have, we should really correct. Because otherwise, I just feel this kind of confrontational stuff. And by the way, AGIs, they learn how we humans treat each other and how we treat our machines. So this is the time to reflect on ourselves. So let's be really, don't be confrontational, don't use sticks with each other, and then don't do that towards AGI as well. They're gonna learn, right? So.
Interesting. So you commented about learning from the Cold War, and I wonder how would you translate that into one misconception that you think you could change or you should change in the race dynamic?
Yeah. So I think first, so the Cold War is sort of about as bad and hostile a competition as there is. So that we were able to succeed in building forms of risk-reducing cooperation during that period suggests that we should be at least as ambitious as our counterparts were during the Cold War. I think one misconception is that right now people, at least in the US policy community, really are not tracking AGI as a topic. They're not enamored with this topic. So if in trying to find ways of engaging with the US policy community at least, and maybe others could talk about other countries' policy communities, I wouldn't frame this in terms of AGI. I think that could have unintended consequences anyway, but I would frame it in terms of other things that are more concrete and accessible, like nearer-term AI security issues that may overlap with some of the longer-term AGI safety issues. That, I think, is a framing that's much more likely to capture the interest and support of policymakers in ways that are constructive and not destructive.
Interesting.
One thing also that Jan was mentioning a few years back, AGI is more and more accepted in the global discourse now. You find it more also in public policy scene, although it's not. I haven't seen it really in any of the AI strategy documents that have been written by various governments. So one thing to do might be also to educate governments and policymakers about that. We're talking about guidelines on policymakers, so that's something we could include there. Also, so it's also educating them on the notion of value alignment and why it's important there. So that's something I would add.
Bringing AGI out into the world. Interesting.
With precaution.
Charlotte?
Yeah, I want to kind of get off of your point. This might be slightly controversial. I'm not sure. I'm going to say it anyway. I think when we discuss governance of AI and collaboration, cooperation, we need to be very certain and quite honest with ourselves. Do we mean cooperation between the nations we think right now are racing and winning the race? So China and America, basically. Or do we mean global cooperation? Or do we mean cooperation between all the large nations, so Canada, Australia, the European Union, China, Japan, etc., etc., etc.? Because the mechanisms are going to be drastically different that we need to employ in order to achieve cooperation between 2 countries, 5 countries, the entire globe. So I just invite people to actually think, kind of disentangle what we mean when we discuss cooperation for artificial intelligence.
Okay.
I would say global. I mean, the reason I use US China is sort of easy. that's what the Care Robots project I'm thinking about. Sorry. That's a global issue, not just, China has it, Japan has it, and then, Western countries all have it, right? So the aging population. So I thought that would be, kind of a less sensitive project but that would be a great global project, to be honest. So that's my view.
Maybe education, also a shared platform.
Absolutely.
We have a very short time to take audience questions, so quick, no statements, actual questions.
While I'm waiting for a mic, Charlotte, thanks so much. IEEE has 14 standards working groups. We've had them for 3 years. They're open to anyone to join. It's focused on things like facial recognition, multiple things on personal data, and standards are a form of soft governance. They're a way to build consensus before you get to the legal place, so anyone's welcome to join those. I want to ask about China. A lot of feedback we've been getting on our paper. We did 3 drafts. The second draft, a lot of people said, wow, this is Western. And what was great is Shannon Valor, if no one's read the book, Technology and the Virtues, I think it's one of the most important books to read in the space today, at least in terms of short-term AI. And what she talks about is that utilitarianism, because you said this in your opening comments, utilitarianism is really about engineers, let's build the elevator so it doesn't crash, and that's kind of important. Then deontological stuff is what you're saying, and here a lot of things, the philosophers in the room, I'm not one, but I can hear them in my voice saying, we say things like, let's do the right thing, let's do the good things. That means nothing in a room of philosophers because you have to say what does right mean for who. Virtue ethics, as Shannon describes brilliantly in her book, is this sort of way of saying we actually have to find those things, not care robots, but those things where when we agree on them together in unison, then the good is actually a unison thing. And also in the East, virtue ethics seems to be something through Confucianism. This is a statement. Does all that make sense?
You mean from China's point of view?
Yeah.
By the way, I can't speak on behalf of the entire country. I can only speak on behalf of myself. So I would say a lot of it does make sense, but I don't know how that's going to be applied. In fact, I've been thinking hard about the ethical framework for regulating humans and machines, for future references. I was thinking about something like a compassion ethics. And then so the compassion ethics, it's, in a way that there's so much we can draw from our tradition, the Chinese Confucianism, and then, and also it speaks about people or agents in the power relationship. When you say compassion, you have parents towards children, you have people in a power position towards the weaker ones. And then so there's rich resources in Chinese philosophy about how that relation should be regulated, what's the people in powerful position, the kind of obligations you have towards the weaker ones. And then of course, so I think that would be a very useful framework. At this point, we could use that framework to, at this point, humans are still ruling the world, it appears to be anyway. And then, we use that framework, to regulate how we treat the animals and the weaker beings. Hopefully in the future, AGIs will learn from this, and then if they become more cognitively or this level, they're more powerful, they're going to learn, they're going to be compassionate towards us. So we all have our space in this universe. So I was just thinking about it, and actually I also had a discussion with the E about that as well, but it's still evolving. So I haven't come up with the...
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you enjoy coffee.
Thank you.